Hey guys, Trip here, and welcome to Welcome To. This is a new series where I tell you all about something fun that you may not have heard of before. It could be a comic series, a video game, a novel, or just a little known subgenre that I think deserves some more attention. Since a lot of what we'll be talking about here revolves around the fantasy genre, I thought it would be fitting to talk about fantasy in general before we get into some of the obscure stuff. Think of this episode as a prequel, an episode 0 of sorts. So, what is fantasy anyway? Well, the Oxford Dictionary has several definitions, the most well-known being a genre of imaginative fiction involving magic and adventure, especially in a setting other than the real world. Individually, I don't think any of these definitions are adequate, but when you put them all together, it gives you a broader picture of what I think fantasy can be. Now, the thing I like about fantasy is that there are no limits. You can take the world in any direction you want, unbound by reality or conventional logic. As long as the world is consistent and interesting, there are no limits to the stories you can tell. So, fantasy can be divided into hundreds of genres and subgenres, but for the purpose of this series, we're going to simplify it a bit. It's worth noting that what I'm about to explain is very subjective and open to interpretation. There's not much of a clear consensus on what separates one subgenre from another, but consider the following an operational definition, something we use for the specific purpose of this series. In my mind, fantasy can be displayed on a spectrum, with 4 major subgenres at each end. Most fantasy works are somewhere in between, but let's take a look at the extremes for a moment. First off, we have high fantasy. High fantasy is what people typically imagine when they think of fantasy in general. These stories typically take place in entirely fictional settings, are completely detached from the laws of our universe, and almost always include sentient species other than humans. Think Lord of the Rings, Dragon Age, The Elder Scrolls, and Warcraft. There's also epic fantasy. A lot of people think epic fantasy is synonymous with high fantasy. Even Wikipedia redirects you to its high fantasy page if you try and type this in. I don't think this does it justice, however. To me, epic fantasy specifically looks at the scale of the story itself, not the setting. Epic fantasy relies on grand, sweeping narratives, world-threatening antagonists, and multiple nations working with and against one another. Most high fantasy settings utilize epic fantasy narratives, but it's not a requirement. Next, we have low fantasy. Low fantasy typically takes place on worlds more similar to our own. As a rule, the universe mimics our own unless otherwise stated. Supernatural elements exist, but are often more subtle in nature. To the people of these worlds, typical fantasy elements are not the norm, and anything supernatural is a break from their daily routine. Sentient races other than humans may exist, but they are often much more mysterious, aloof, and alien in nature to the general populace. Think Conan the Barbarian, or even some works by H.P. Lovecraft. Lastly, we have sword and sorcery. And this is the classic adventure subgenre. Sword and sorcery focuses on more intimate, small-scale narratives. Saving the princess from an evil sorcerer, searching for ancient treasure, slaying a dragon, and saving the townsfolk. These tales almost always feature a romantic element, or at the very least romanticized characters, but the main idea here is that the story is on a smaller, more personal scale. So we have these 4 basic extremes, but as we all know, fantasy isn't bound by strict, cookie-cutter subgenres. In reality, most fantasy worlds tend to fall somewhere in the middle, and there are countless subgenres in between the ones I mentioned. So now that you know a little more about fantasy, here's some examples to get you started. Now, obviously there's countless examples of fantasy to choose from, but this is just a quick snapshot. Lord of the Rings. It's basically a requirement to talk about this when discussing fantasy. There's a reason Lord of the Rings is still considered a staple of the genre. It has a detailed world, beautiful imagery, a great story, and it's just plain fun. Dragon Age. I know people are divided on the actual gameplay of this series, but the world itself is amazing. I usually find European medieval fantasy to get boring very quickly, but Dragon Age executes it so well that I can't help but be enthralled. The world of Thedas manages to be both extremely familiar and fascinatingly bizarre, and the setting alone keeps me coming back to the games time and time again. It also has my favorite dwarves out of any fantasy series, but that's another story. Conan the Barbarian. I'm actually going to do a whole video on this, but the Conan universe is one of my favorites. It takes place after the fall of Atlantis, and it's a gritty, hostile, often dark-humored world with a fair share of Lovecraftian elements. Oddworld. Oddworld is one of the strangest, quirkiest, most charming video game worlds I've ever seen. I grew up with this series, and it's a perfect example of the weirder side of fantasy. I highly recommend it. So that's your crash course on fantasy. What did you think of this video? I'm planning on making a whole series out of this, so let me know what you think. What should I talk about next? Are there any genres or franchises you'd like to talk about? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.